This is just a part of a series. There's my newsletter, which is the Change Thoughts, and my newsletters are just compositions of my posts, and these sessions, these talks are compositions of what I post as well on LinkedIn, and additional material that needs talking through, I guess, rather than just posting on LinkedIn. So if you are following me on LinkedIn, you will be familiar with some of the stuff that you see here, but most of it will be new. And also this gives us the opportunity just to just for me to be a bit more interactive, and for you to challenge me and ask questions and ask for clarifications, and me just to check whether all this stuff sort of works, and whether the journey that we're going on kind of makes sense, and obviously for you to input your experience as well as change practitioners into this whole process. And I guess, sorry, if people could just put themselves on mute, unless you want to say something. And yeah, I guess this is really me trying to change the way that we do change in a more evidence-based way. And this is an important place to start, the history of organisational change, because for me it tells a story of how two different disciplines, or two disciplines that started off the same, sort of split, and now we're starting to sort of see a convergence, and hopefully that convergence will carry on, and we'll get more integration between the practitioner experience and the sort of academic view as well, and an integration between things like organisational development and organisational design and change management and organisational change, all these lots of words that people use, which really mean the same thing, which I will sort of present as well. So what are we going to cover? So I just thought I'd just discuss why this is important, which I've already touched on, and how we interpret the history of organisational change is important. And I think this is an interesting point as well, that when we go as practitioners, when we go into organisations, how are we interpreting what's going on in that organisation? What lens are we using to interpret what we see happening, the data that we see as well? And that's obviously biased by our own history as practitioners and what we've learned as well. And similarly, when we look at the history of organisational change as well, that's obviously biased, and our interpretation is based on our underlying assumptions and mental models. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into that as well, which I thought would be useful. And then I was just going to challenge you guys on what your underlying assumptions are, and then maybe, you know, question those as well, as I've been doing for the last sort of 4 years, having to sort of question everything that I was taught as part of my organisational change education as well. And then we'll get on to the actual history, and then you can sort of see whether the whole story fits together. Okay, good. Any questions so far? Everybody's happy with they can see everything and they can see the chats. If you could fill out the form, if you weren't here at the beginning, if you could fill out the form, just leave your email and name, that'd be great, just because then it makes it easier for me to send you copies of the slides and the video. And in terms of time, this isn't going to be 2 hours. It's probably going to be an hour, maybe, of me talking and interacting with you guys, and then we can have, you know, as much time as you want after that to discuss some of these things in more detail. So let's move on to the why I think organisational change is important, and why it's a good starting point for understanding how we can build a body of knowledge around organisational change. So I thought that I would explain it using a story, and because we know how powerful stories are in organisational change. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mark Hughes's work. Have you seen any of his papers that he's written about the 70% failure rate myth, and sort of questioning that, and also questioning Kotter's work as well on change management? So his story is interesting because way back in 1993, Hammer and Champy came up with this estimate, finger in the air. They called it an unscientific estimate that organizational change programs fail. Between 50 and 70% of them fail, and they openly admitted this was unscientific. It was just their experience, and it was about re-engineering specifically. And obviously there are lots of different types of change, strategic change or culture change or technology deployment or whatever it is. And that idea of a 70%, that was then taken as a 70% failure rate, and then it was reiterated several times by Beer and Noria and Cotter in 2008 and other people, 2008, 2009. It just kept on reappearing in papers and books written about organizational change, and before you know it, everybody starts quoting, 70% of organizational change programs fail. Now, what I find interesting about this is not necessarily whether that's true or not, but Mark Hughes went into this thinking, okay, well, this is interesting. So somebody's found a figure, a 70% failure rate. I want to understand, what knowledge base is this built on? What assumptions are being made around how we measure failure rates? And if we can measure failure rates, then that must mean that we have some systematic approach to measuring, before and after, that's built on some body of knowledge where we know, from previous change programs that they failed and succeeded. And so he was interested in exploring this. And he was a little bit disappointed because when he got to it, he just found actually that it was just a made up number, that it wasn't based on any sort of theories or any epistemology, for want of a fancy word, or any ontology. It was just purely made up. And so he wrote this paper in 2011, said, right, guys, this number is really dodgy. We should be questioning it, and we should stop repeating it, and we should stop making this quite damaging assumption that all of our change efforts fail. Then he, in 2016, Cotter then changed the language around change management and started talking around, rather than change management, he was talking about change leadership, and he was distinguishing between management and leadership. And so Mark Hughes started to sort of question that notion as well, and also the re-quoting of the failure of transformation rates as well. So he started questioning Cotter, 70% failure rate, and then I think one of the journals went out to publications around the 70% failure rate. So one of the journals actually said, okay, so can we get some papers around what's causing this 70% failure rate? And I think Mark Hughes was pulling his hair out at this stage, saying the whole point was that there isn't a 70% failure rate. So he sort of challenged this, and in 2021, he said, look, you're misquoting me here. I wasn't saying there's a 70% failure rate. I'm saying that it's a questionable number. And actually, he says that he was actually called a Taliban scholar because he was questioning all the other scholars about what they were thinking. And then it was only in 2022 where you could see he's just published an article explaining his whole story about how him pointing out something that was wrong and was just misguided rhetoric within our practice turned him into a Taliban scholar, and took him years to sort of, and he ended up being misquoted. And then he had to go and explain, re-explain his position in 2022. And I think this tells a strong story that if we start off with myths, or if we start off with misplaced beliefs about our practice, and they start to get ingrained, it's very difficult to unpick them. And particularly when the whole system, when scholars and everybody starts quoting these numbers. And I think that applies to us individually as well as change practitioners, that we need to be very careful on what basis we are making claims and on what basis we are forming beliefs about the way that we should do our practice. So that I guess that's my opening gambit, and you can you can stop the session now if you want to, if that's too much. But I just thought that this was a nice condensed story about how things can go terribly wrong if we don't actually form beliefs based on some sort of epistemology, some kind of idea of what we're trying to do, some kind of robust knowledge base, etc. So our interpretation of history, you know, the lens through which we look at history determines how we interpret it. And there are lots of different ways in which we can interpret what's going on, not just in history, I guess, but our day-to-day lives. You know, do we rely on facts? So one interpretation of history is that, you know, facts are objective, you know, data is objective, and we can reconstruct the past by linking up these various facts and form factual opinions and objective views of what's happening. And this is all deterministic, you know, it's not sort of up for question. And then we have the sort of sense making side, which is more, well, actually facts are up for interpretation, and everything is socially constructed, and that our interpretation of what's going on is highly subjective, but it's still deterministic in that, you know, it's our cognitive processes which we don't necessarily sort of control, and the systems around us that drive us in a certain direction. And then we have the sort of power view, which is you know, that organizations consist of powers acting for and against maybe change, which was sort of Lewin's idea, which we'll come on to later, his force field, and that whoever controls that power, you know, gets to do the change. And again, this is, you know, sort of objective. It's you know, real power within organizations, but it's malleable. It's malleable depending on people's sort of power status. And so the interpretation here of history as well, Cotter has the power. Cotter is the guy who's published all the books. He's the guru. So whatever his interpretation is the right interpretation, and that will balance the power to his interpretation. So that's what I mean by the power sort of interpretation. And then we have the rhetoric, which is kind of what I'm doing, which is sort of making up stories and narratives around what's happened and interpreting, doing a bit of sense making, interpreting things in my way and using the facts in my way to get you to believe what I believe, which is also an important mechanism for creating change in organizations as well. So we create, you know, communication strategies, don't we, which have a narrative, and they try to reinterpret the past and selective about the facts that we use to get our point across. So therefore, and I'm sure you can think of maybe other ways, but there are just these two quotes here that I thought were useful. That variations in how we conceptualize change are underpinned by different assumptions, the assumptions that we make about the history and relationships, and the capacity, say, for an organization to change. And I think the same applies for us as practitioners as well. And when we evaluate something, when we evaluate the merits of something, or you're evaluating what I'm saying, then that in itself is a form of, you know, it's informed by your epistemology, how you think knowledge is pulled together, and how, say, authoritative you think I am, or how coherent I am, or whatever it is, and also your perception of reality in terms of how you think the world works. So I think this is all very important stuff, and it's just to give you a warning sign that whatever I say isn't the truth. You know, there is no truth. I'm just like anybody else. I have my own biases and etc. So yeah, please challenge me. But I think that's an important point to raise. I think the other important thing that we need to look at as well when we look back on the history of organizational change is whether these constructs that we're talking about, whether we really know what we're talking about. And there's something in science called construct validity, which and a construct is just an abstract categorization of observations. So we say, you know, if it's got legs and it's made of wood and I can sit on it, you know, it's a chair. So I have a construct of a chair. Similarly, we have a construct of psychological safety. You know, if people seem to talk freely in a meeting and they don't feel that they're at risk of, you know, sort of embarrassment or ridicule or whatever, then we say, okay, well, that looks like a psychologically safe environment. And it's important to have definitions, because if we don't really know what we're talking about. So we don't have a foundation for understanding where we're going to go. And I get a bit frustrated with definitions of change. So this is the ADKAR one, which says the people side of change. So the people side of change, well, organizations consist of people, and there's no change without people. You know, IT platforms can't change themselves, processes can't change themselves, it's people. So to say that change is the people side of change is just saying, well, change is it's just a circular tautology. It doesn't help us understand what we really mean by change. It's just saying change is about people and people change things, and that's not helpful. So definitions need to be very clear and precise. The other thing as well is scope. So when we're clear about what we're talking about, then within what conditions are we talking about? You know, when is a chair a chair? When is psychological safety psychological safety? Well, psychological safety isn't maybe an individual concept. You know, psychological safety is a group concept. Okay, so it applies within groups. So we're talking about group psychological safety. Okay, great. And again, we struggle with this in change management because, say you take the Kubler-Ross curve, that maybe, and it doesn't, but people thought that it applied within, you know, grieving, for example. You know, so therapists would use it to help people get through their grieving, and it doesn't apply in grieving. So there are, you know, it's been sort of not, I'm looking for a nicer word than sort of rubbish, but it's found that, you know, only 15% of people actually go through those stages that Kubler-Ross identified. But we go one step further in change management. We actually take that and we use it in a completely unrelated discipline. So it's out of scope because we've never tested it within our organizational change discipline. So there's a scope issue there. Similarly, brains hate change, you know, or brains. So I'm just letting people in. Or using neuroscience, for instance, to say, so using something that's taken place in a laboratory where people have had their fingers pricked or had their hands dunked in hot water to induce stress, measuring that stress level, and then equating that stress level with something that's happening in an organization during a change program. Now that, again, we'll talk about this, is an enormous, extraordinary extrapolation from the individual in a laboratory into a group setting within an organization. So we have to be careful about scope as well. Sense of urgency is another one. What do we mean by sense of urgency? So Cotter and Connor talk about creating pain, which is one end of the spectrum. And Cotter also mentions that it's just not being happy with business as usual. So two ends, two completely different things. Also, when we look at methods that are being used and models that are being used in organizational change, we need to understand, well, what's the relationship between this model and that model, or this theory and that theory? You know, what's the relationship between trust in leadership and psychological safety, or fairness in decision making and trust in leaders, for example? And we can start to, because they're clearly defined, we can start to relate different ideas. And a nice example of this is a self-determination theory, if you're familiar with motivation theory. So self-determination theory takes the idea of autonomy from Allport, and takes the idea of belonging and relatedness from Maslow, and takes the idea of competence and efficacy from Bandura, and pulls all these together in sort of like a general theory about motivation. And that's really helpful because we know that those individual constructs are valid, they've been tested, and then when we pull them together, we then test that construct as well. And so we have a really robust theory of motivation. We don't see, well, this is my argument, we don't see that in change management either. A lot of these theories are developed in isolation and don't refer to. And then there's the idea of sort of coherence as well, which is, you know, related to, you know, this idea of aggregate constructs that we can pull together lots of different areas and create a coherent, and employee engagement is another one, and I'll come on to that as well. So these are the four things that when we look at whether these change management, when we look through the history, we should be bearing this in mind. Are these change managers are they just plucked out of the sky? Are they based on any previous? Are we clear about what people are talking about, etc.? So, and then the last slide before we have a quick break and I sort of hand things over to you a bit. So just an example of definition. This is a definition of organisational change. These are definitions of organisational change. It's taken from SHRM, which is the US HR certification, people like UK CIPD, and we got Harvard Business Review as well. And again, you know, we see in the Harvard Business Review definition a bit of a circular tautology, because it rather than organisational change refers to actions in which a company or business alters a major component or its a business alters a major component. Well, alters means change. So again, we're just saying change is change. What is change? And it doesn't really sort of define it. And again, we have, and then the difference between organisational change and change management. You know, is there really any difference? And this point that I mentioned as well about Prosai's definition about it's the people side of change. What does that mean? Why are we changing? In what what context would we change? Why is change helpful? Why, you know, these definitions just seem to lack any real clarity. So we'll come on to that as well. They seem to be very general and very high level. So what are your underlying assumptions? So I thought it would be fun just to just for you to tell me. Oh, I can't. That's annoying. Hang on. I can't copy and paste the link. I'm just going to get the link for you now. But if you could tell me, if you could name these four, and I guess you were coming onto the call thinking that I wouldn't be testing you. It's not a test. It's just a well, it's a bit of a test, I guess. Can you just quickly write in where you think what the names of these models are? So model one, if you just open that link, it'll ask you. So what model is model one? Do you know which one that is? Or you can just write it in the. I was trying to formalize it, but you can just write it in. So Lewin, yeah, Vincent's got Lewin, Zoe's got Lewin. Okay, so everybody knows that's Lewin now. So Vincent and Lewin, you can't vote on the next one because you're obviously the. So number two, what's number two? Do you recognise that? Sorry, yeah, glasses are having to go on because it's a small. Cotter, yes, Cotter. I think Edwina, you've gone for number three there. So everybody's got Cotter. Everybody knows Cotter. Number three. You're on this now, Edwina. Yep. Edwina's got Kubler-Ross. Okay, so we recognise those three. What about number four? Does anybody know that one? Sixborg, Weisborg. I haven't heard of those actually, but I'd be interested to know. So yeah, so this is Burke-Litwin's change model, and it's a dynamic sort of. It's got feedback mechanisms which you can see other models don't have, but it's actually quite complicated to look at, isn't it? And I just wondered whether there's something around how digestible these models are in terms of why we know them. But in fact, the Burke-Lewin model has been tested by them, and none of these other models have been empirically tested. Kotter's model has been bits of Kotter's model have been empirically tested, but not the whole model as a whole thing. So yeah, so that I thought that was interesting. So we're definitely biased towards these sort of linear models that don't have feedback loops, that maybe are extrapolated from unrelated. So this one was, I was going to, we look for the simple. We do, definitely. I just wonder whether that's a bias, maybe there's a simplicity bias or something there that we need to overcome, because we all know that change is complex. So this next one, there's a form there if you want to click on that. What are the underlying assumptions? What are your underlying assumptions, sorry, about organizational change? And again, you can just type this in if you don't want to use the link. But what are your underlying assumptions? What do you think, say humans' natural reaction to change is, or what sort of state organizations need to be in order to change? Do you think that people are naturally resistant to change? For example, is change always, in your experience, is change always difficult? To some organisations, change better than others. Great. Okay. So Jen, yes, depends on the context and depends on the individual. So that's any other. What do you always say to clients when you go to clients? You say, well, we know change is difficult. We know people resist change. We know. Depends on whether they choose to change. Yep. So whether it's top down, is change always top down? Change is always top down. Change isn't always top down. And when you look at Kotter, for example, and Prozi, neither of them talk about understanding or the genesis of change. They assume change is already happening. So it doesn't help you in terms of, right, so how do I do some sort of change readiness or understand what the motivation is behind the change? And if context is important, then those are the sort of questions we really need to be. People aren't innately resistant to change, but I see resistance as a positive cue to get curious. Yes, so change is, yeah, so resistance is just an expression of difference, isn't it? It's someone who's just not thinking the way that you're thinking, maybe. Agency matters, yeah. So, yeah, good, great. So, so we all have sort of underlying ideas, and it's great actually that a lot of you are sort of saying things like, well, it all depends, because that's exactly it, isn't it? It all depends on the context. And so going for one model won't necessarily work. We need to have lots of models in our head, but at the end of the day, how do we know which of those models works if they're not evidence-based, and which parts of those models to use in which context? So it becomes quite complicated. Change is happening without their input. Agency matters. Yeah. So thank you for that. I just thought it'd be worth exploring our own bias. You've seen what my bias is. So let's get on to this this journey, this change journey. So this is, I think it's my most popular post to date on on LinkedIn. I thought it would be too complicated for people, but in fact, people seem to like this idea that, and this is my interpretation of the history, that during the 1940s and 1950s we had let me start with the dark line. It hasn't come out here, but the dark line is change management. What I'm saying is the development of change management, and the lighter line is organizational development theories. And I'm saying that during the 40s and 50s and into the 60s and 70s, these two disciplines were working well together. And it would be interesting to find out when the first time change management was used as a term. if anybody has the answer to that, that would be great. So, sorry, someone was knocking on my door, which is distracting me. So, yeah, so during this time, that those two areas were pretty much integrated. There wasn't really a definition. Oh, someone's got their hand up. Who's that? Just speak if you want to say something. Sorry if you got your hand up. I'm just figuring out how. Oh, Vincent, you got your hand up.
Sorry, actually I don't. That's just misclick. My bad.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So yeah, these two disciplines start off, being the same thing. I think there was just people just talking about organizational development. And certainly the books that were published around that time were talking about organizational development. And around this time, we get Lewin's unfreeze, change, refreeze idea, and his sort of idea of habits that, or in order to break habits, he talks about tension. So the force field. So he viewed people having sort of fields around them, and there's a force field that has tension within it, and we're fighting tensions for and against change. Maybe what he meant by that is sort of motivation, that the tension is energy, and energy is around motivating ourselves to move forward and to change. But yeah, it's sort of early days of that, and then we have a lot going on around building up constructs. So we have Alport talking about autonomy, and lots of other things going on in the 40s and 50s, which we'll talk about in more detail. And then we come on to the 60s, and for me, this is where we start to see a bit of a split with change management, because we get Shen, who just sort of regurgitates Lewin's three-phase model. So he puts it as a three-phase model. And then Lippitt as well, I think was 58, and he put it into a 7 or a 5-stage model. And you get Kubler-Ross publishing her stuff then as well in 1969. So we start to see an extrapolation of Lewin's idea, but at the same time we get lots of interesting ideas in organizational development about what does context mean, and how do organizations interact with their environment, and how do individuals interact with their environment, which is a bit of the force field stuff from Lewin. We get the idea of complexity and open systems, and viewing organizations as social systems as well. And then we hit the 1980s and 1990s, and what we see there is Cotter and other change management specialists then just extrapolating more around Lewin's 3-stage and seeing organizational changes being linear. And we get this idea of sort of pop psychology with Peter Waterman and Search of Excellence book, and people wanted quick fixes to problems that they were facing, because we were facing international energy crisis and economic collapse during the early 80s and late 70s. And meanwhile, organizational development was building more and more constructs, more robust constructs, and we get Ryan and Decky talking about self-determination theory and goal-setting theory from Locke and Latham. And then in the late 2000s, we see really there aren't any more end-step models being produced. We get ADKAR, but then we get a bit of neuroscience from the SCARF model. We get someone using Kubler-Ross's model, Luke, in 2003. And meanwhile, in organizational development, they're applying processes called meta-analysis, where they're then taking all of these studies that have taken place around self-efficacy, organizational justice, trust in leadership, psychological safety, etc., and it's just producing these comprehensive views of what these constructs mean. And so that's broadly how I see the history. That change management sort of separated itself from organizational development, went off at a bit of a tangent, just regurgitated lots of stuff that was already out there, and has hit a bit of a brick wall, which is why we don't see any more of these models. And I think people are getting a bit fed up of them. which is why I think that evidence-based management is becoming important, because people are starting to tap into this OD source of knowledge. So let's just deep dive into this stuff a bit more. This is just a summary of the journey that I'm going to take you on now, that we start to see the emergence of constructs. We start to see the importance, people understand the importance of context and complexity in organizational change, people advocating a scientific mindset in terms of organizational development, core constructs really being developed, and then this synthesis, and then we are becoming more confident in our causal claims around what these constructs can do. And I think that leads us on this nice sort of upward spiral, because there's so much to explore, say within the concept of organizational fairness in organizational decision making. There's so much to explore in that area and its impact on change management. Same with psychological safety, same with trust in leadership, same with goal setting, motivation theory, all this sort of stuff is directly applicable to change. And we haven't even touched the surface, I don't think. Whereas on the other hand, I think, you know, if we carry on with change management as it is, with these end-step models, we end up hitting this brick wall, because at the end of the day, they're just extraordinary extrapolations. There's a lot of pop psychology in them as well. We don't really know what the evidence is that backs up those theories. And we end up having to disentangle, and if any of you are familiar with my Mythbusters, you have to disentangle the sort of made up reality from the sort of empirical reality, as it were, from what the research is telling us. So that's why I've been writing these Mythbusters, and academics have been myth busting as well around sort of learning styles and MBTI and all that sort of stuff. So the history, so we get the emergence of psychological constructs. So Gordon Outport, autonomy seems to be such a big thing now. Everybody's talking about autonomy, and it's so important in terms of understanding diversity and inclusion. How do we give people autonomy within structure of an organization, you know, the freedom to express themselves? It's so important, and that dates back to 1937. And then we get these ideas of competency and efficacy, that people want to the sort of state of mind where I feel that I can do things even if I don't have the skills necessarily to do it, but I just feel competent, and a sense of self-efficacy to be able to do something and give it a go, which again, critical to organizational change, and not mentioned in sort of end-step models and things. And then we get Harry Harlow talking about, you know, his experiments with belonging relatedness, and we know that that was then used by Maslow as well in his sort of hierarchy of needs. So, you know, there's a lot going on there, and this really started this big debate that has gone on kind of forever within change management and organizational development, is this dichotomy between, or this paradox between, autonomy and structure. And it still goes on now, because it's about diversity and inclusion. You know, how much do people have to toe the company line versus how much autonomy do we give? You know, where does decision making sit? How much autonomy do we give people in decision making? Does it sit with frontline staff? Does it sit with middle managers? Does it really sit with leaders? How does that decision making process impact on organizational change and ability to change? And then this whole idea of agile cultures as well. Agile cultures require lower level decision making. So this is a, you know, a really rich area, and something that has been around for sort of 70 years. And as I say, you know, it underpins these ideas of diversity and inclusion. How do we balance individual uniqueness and belonging? And these were concepts that people were grappling with in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And from that, you get this idea of organizations. So this is coming from this sort of Taylorist view of creating sort of bureaucratic sort of hierarchies, although that's potentially a misinterpretation of Taylor's work. But people started to then challenge, well, you know, if autonomy is important, then why have we got hierarchies? Hierarchies devolve decision making from people who probably may be best placed to make the decisions. So then we get into people challenging or running studies and saying, well, actually, collaborative cultures and cultures that are less hierarchical are actually are higher performing cultures. And those studies have iterated through organizational development as well, and started off in 1949 with Merton and then Blau. And then Paul Lawrence talks about his case study about an organization going through change and decentralizing and the impact that had and trying to create more autonomy. And then Lawrence and LaRoche and Bird-and-Stork are also talking about how we can make organizations more organic and self-organizing, and we know that complex systems are self-organizing as well. So there was this sort of revolt, I guess, way back then against the sort of Tayloristic view of organization and organizational development. And again, this is all contextual, because what you find during the 1940s and 1950s was this whole sort of biology and physics was developing these ideas of open, complex systems, and that was then influencing what these guys were obviously thinking about in terms of organizations, that organizations are living sort of systems, as it were. So, you know, wonderful ideas, amazing, and so relevant now to the issues that organizations face at the moment, and everything that's been discussed, I guess, on LinkedIn around agility and autonomy and diversity and inclusion and everything else. And then we start to get real sort of tighter formalization of what organizations might look like as complex systems. And French and Bell come up with this model, and Katz and Kahn, if you haven't read their book, it's just mind-blowing really to read it and to think about the context that was being written and how applicable it is now. And that's where the other model that the Bertwin model that I mentioned earlier comes from, this this sort of thinking about complex systems. So whilst all that's happening, all that exciting stuff, and Lewin was very much keyed into this because he was talking about force field analysis. We talked about, you know, tensions within the field, and maybe that's an early conception of ideas of sort of motivation and energy and engagement, and action research. So he was saying, well, you know, we should be creating experiments within organizations. We should be planning and then actioning and then fact finding, seeing what happens. So we run an intervention and then we see what happens to that intervention, then we learn from that, and we end up on this sort of upward spiral, which is exactly what evidence-based management is trying to do, and what agile is as well, I guess. And this idea of group dynamics as well, that when people come together, there's something happens. There's a sort of a magic that happens that's more than just the individuals. And so, yeah, theories of group dynamics. So all that exciting stuff was happening. But what change management decided to go with was unfreezing, freezing, unfreezing, moving, and then refreezing. And what's interesting here as well, this is taken from Lewin's Frontiers in Group Dynamics, which I copied. He says here, to break open the shell of complacency and self-righteousness, it is sometimes necessary to bring about deliberately an emotional stir-up. So then you can start to see, well, where did this idea of creating a sense of urgency come from, or Connor's creating pain in organizations? Well, it's kind of there. If you know, if you take that as a serious comment and a well-researched idea by Lewin, then okay, maybe we need to create emotional stir-up in organizations. If you take it as a sort of just a glib sort of comment, well, sometimes you just got to give people a bit of a nudge, then it doesn't really justify being a whole first step in the most popular organizational change model that we have. So I think it's interesting when you read this stuff and you can see where the origins of some of these models that we're using come from. And so from those three steps, we get Lippitt's 5-step model, which I mentioned, and Shen's 1961 model. And then we get Phillips from McKenzie, who came up with his first, the 4 steps. And he was the first person to mention creating a sense of concern. you know, you can see here Lippitt doesn't mention that. Develop a need for change, which I guess you can argue is creating an emotional stir up. But for me, creating a need for change would be understanding what the need is, you know. And then we get Kotter's model, and he's clearly taken from Philip's model, create this sense of urgency rather than sense of concern. And then, as I mentioned, during the 80s and 90s, we just get 11 of these models within 11 years, all pretty much saying the same thing, but kind of in a different order. And then you sort of wonder, well, where is the science in all of this? There's not a lot of science in just extrapolating what Lewin said. And what I found surprising when I was reading this a few months ago was it's very explicit. Even Carl Rogers, who's working in the most sort of ethereal, I guess, area of change, when he, you know, his sort of counselling and psychotherapy, even he is advocating how important it is to adopt a scientific mindset and test our theories and our models. And obviously, Kurt Lewin was very much into this as well, because he was running experiments in organisations. And Jay Forrester says the same thing, that if we don't use a scientific mindset, then everything becomes a bit disorganized, and we don't really understand where we are, which I think is where we are now, potentially with change management. So then I just thought, what I find often is people mistake, sorry, I'm just trying to get your comments. Thanks, Zoe. What I find is people mistake science for data and get lost in the data. Yes, and yeah, and by scientific mindset, I don't mean just crunching numbers, and you know, I mean the sense of curiosity and a sense of trying to understand the system, you know, being creative and being inventive, but then as you know, inventing hypothesis, and then going into an organization and testing, right, is this really going to work? You know, I have a few ideas, let's go out and test them. That's what I mean by a scientific mindset. And obviously you need to, yeah, crunch the numbers, I guess, at the end. Good. Okay, thanks for all those comments. Sorry, I haven't been tuning into the comments, but I will do. But yeah, we're coming towards the end, I guess. So here, these are just different definitions of organizational change, organizational development, strategic HR, and change management. And what I'm trying to say here is that although these two disciplines kind of separated, that we're still doing the same thing. And I just try to summarize that as just saying that it's a practice of continually adapting. So change is about continually adapting human capability. So we're talking about human capability to meet an organization's internal and external ambitions. And that for me just seemed to sort of summarize what all these other people are saying. And it also relates to complex systems and the fact that organizations are open living systems as well. So it'd be good to get your opinions on that definition as well, which I have tried to keep simple. And I guess one of the questions that I'm struggling with as well is why did this split happen? Because the split between change management and organizational development happened for a reason. And I don't know, you know, is it as simple as, well, they just had better marketing tools, and academics being academics were just stuck in the numbers and were just churning out research, whereas Kotter was very good at marketing. You know, you see him in videos and stuff. Is it the fact that there weren't the constructs in organizational development at the time weren't good enough? You know, that they weren't developed enough, and actually it took meta-analysis to actually create constructs that people were really confident in. But then arguably people were listening to Kotter and all the others in change management who weren't using any research at all. So maybe organizations weren't interested in robust constructs anyway. Maybe people are interested in quick fixes, you know, nice pictures. One other idea as well is just that academics get caught up in what is knowledge, what is the right way to address a problem, Whereas in practice, what you're looking for and what organizations are looking for is, how do I do this? How do I apply the knowledge to a practical environment? And so you could argue that research just got a bit lost in the sort of metaphysics of itself. Yeah, and probably all of the above. Brilliant. So what do I think that, these are just some ideas around key concepts. So during the 80s and 90s was sort of golden era, I think, in organizational development. We had these lots of ideas coming up around organizational justice and goal setting theory and psychological safety, which we're all sort of kind of becoming more familiar with now. And we can also see that there are these grand theories like employee engagement. This is some work done by the CIPD, where they did a rapid evidence review. They brought together all the evidence around employee engagement and came up with this structure and divided employee engagement into work motivation, organizational commitment, and employee engagement, organizational identification. And what you can see here in the middle is leadership and organizational justice are critical to, they're at the core of creating employee engagement. And we also know from research that they're also core and critical to change management as well. If we don't trust leaders, and if we don't have fair decision-making processes, then and people don't have voice in those decision-making processes, then change will be more difficult. And then we've got all these other constructs which we know we're familiar with in change as well. Again, around empowering people and being clear on what people's roles are in change, and recognizing people when they demonstrate the behaviors that we want to see, or whatever it is, and the importance of managers in supporting people through the change process. So when people talk about employee engagement, they're also talking about change. The two things for me are completely interdependent and I can't think of the word, but interrelated. Sorry, thank you. Again, coming back to this idea that these disciplines aren't separate, that we're all trying to do the same thing. And this is just an idea through the 80s and 90s. How does pop psychology happen? And this is a sort of a tongue-in-cheek, I guess, but there's quite a lot of reality to this, in that Adrian Furnham's professor of psychology at University College sort of says, well, what tends to happen with pop psychology and why these ideas become so popular, like growth mindset or kind of ideas, is that somebody takes an academic study, one study that has all potentially it's been peer reviewed and all the rest of it, but it hasn't been replicated, or and then they come up with some buzzwords and they say, oh, that's interesting. So people who adopt a growth mindset are more likely to perform than people who don't. Well, it's highly intuitive, makes a lot of sense. People are open to learning, perform better. Great, okay. And then so people form short snippets and buzzwords, and then someone does a TED talk on them. And in fact, the person who did the TED talk on growth mindset wasn't Carol Dweck. It was actually the guy who ran the TED Talks, who presumably was so impressed with this idea that he decided to do it himself several years before Carol Dweck did hers. And then consultants start to take it on board. So you see Matthew Syed, who is now running a whole consultancy out of growth mindset. It's come up with his own psychometric measurement for growth mindset. So consultants go out and start selling it, and then managers become evangelists, because consultants who they're paying a lot of money are saying, well, this is the way to go, and so they start believing it. And then actually academics start testing this stuff and trying to replicate it, and it doesn't seem to give the benefits that they thought it did. And in fact, with growth mindset, there's hardly any relationship between growth mindset and performance, and it's actually quite a confused concept in itself, because it's a mixture of cognitive ability and behavior as well. So is it a behavior? Is it a cognitive sort of ability? So yes, so that's how it happens. So we have to be very careful in kind of what we believe. And yeah, this is sorry, I'm not really sure. Yeah, so this is just sort of saying that Phillips's model from McKinsey just sort of seemed to explode this idea of having step change in linear processes, which again. So I thought I'd just add this slide as well, which is just saying that if you take all those popular models and you push them through a filter or a lens of evidence, what do you end up with? And you end up with this sort of 10-step process, which is, you know, let's get the facts on what we're trying to, what the problem is we're trying to solve. Let's understand whether the organization is ready for that. I think a lot of strategies are launched and then organizations say, right, can we do this? Rather than doing a change assessment, what are we capable of? That should define our strategy. Or what limits can we push our capability to? That should define our strategy. And then, you know, communicate compelling vision, why we want to do this, and then get change leaders educated in understanding what they need to be good at, you know, creating trust, creating psychological safety, all those sort of things in order to create an environment that can change. Running evidence-based interventions. So what do we know from other organizations that work? Yeah, sorry, I was just looking through the comments there. So this is a sort of a generic process that we could use, which would help you not have to carry lots of different change models and then figure out which elements of those change models really work and which ones don't. And then during the during the noughties, we had this sort of myth busting going on. If you haven't read the book Management Theory by Todd Brigham and Stephen Cummings from University, I think it's Brisbane, not Brisbane, New Zealand, sorry, I can't remember the name, that they offer an alternative interpretation of management theory and sort of expose quite a few myths around Tayloristic thinking and what the real origins of Taylor's idea was for the way organisations should be organised. There's the myth busting around the 70% failure rate, why change fails, the unfreeze freeze myth that people argue that's a core of Lewin, whereas this paper is arguing that it's not. And of course, you've got all my Mythbusters as well, which you can refer to the original sources on those. And what I found a little bit disappointing is, I don't know if anybody's from CMI here, and I apologise in advance for this, but this is my take, and I think is sort of evidence-based assumption that I can't remember which year this was now. Was it 2017, 2016? But yeah, the CMI went to a lot of effort producing this change management's handbook, which is a guide to a body of knowledge that they had on change. And in fact, it's got 10 of the myths. So I've written 20 myths, and it refers to 10 of those, sort of saying that these are good tools that we should be using in organizational change, including Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which has sort of been debunked at least 20 years ago in terms of a theory for motivation. And learning styles is in there as well. MBTI is in there. And the Kubler-Ross is in there. How we talk about is very resistance dominated as well. How we overcome resistance rather than treating resistance as a form of difference rather than something that we need to overcome. You know, so I guess I'm disappointed that all this effort goes into producing something which just seems to perpetuate these myths. And this is the problem that we have, and this is the problem that Mark Hughes had, that I mentioned right at the beginning as well. You've got to try and decouple what is actually facts from sort of fiction. And I find the upward spiral of all that research that's taking place in organizational development and the evidence base that's built on, I find it fascinating because you can deconstruct all this stuff based on the evidence. So here is trust. How do I build trust in organizations? Okay, so trust consists of consideration and structure. It consists of leaders being benevolent, leaders having the ability to lead, making good decisions. It consists of predictability in their behavior, and integrity in decision making as well. So that's simple. That's a simple thing we can communicate, and it's based on evidence. So what are the preconditions? What are the conditions that allow that to happen? Well, we have to get the balance right between transformation and transactional leadership. We need to get the principles for decision making sorted out. So there's 3 different types of organizational justice, which I posted about today. When we consider the history of the organization, have there been any contractual breaches? Do people feel that they've been let down by leaders in the past? And has the organization got a history of supporting its staff, say, well-being programs through COVID-19, whatever it is? All that undermines trust. And have our decisions participative? And if we can get that right, then we know that we could potentially get these outcomes. So we get more management support, we get lower turnover intentions, we get belief in the information that's coming out from managers and leaders, and we get a stronger commitment to decisions as well. And so for me, I find this wonderful, because this is great. This is a great piece of information I can take to an organization, and it gives me confidence as a practitioner to be able to say, look, I can be fairly confident, and I can give you the meta-analysis of this, and I can give you all the research that backs this up, but this stuff should work. But let's experiment with it. Let's see how it works within this context. By its very nature, changes. Yes, and that's a good point, Zoe. And it's interesting that Kotter hasn't really changed his 8 steps since he published them in 94, I think 95. So it seems a bit ironic that someone talks about change management but doesn't actually change their own approach to change, which is also interesting. Okay, right, sorry, we're coming on to the last slide. I think we have to stop because I'm sort of losing my voice as well. So it's good to see now, when I showed you this slide of this integration. So I think this is a great piece of work, not necessarily whether it's right or wrong, but what it's trying to do is it's trying to integrate practice, popular change management models, through the lens of evidence. So it's not rubbishing, all these models. It's saying, look, there is some practical elements in them, but let's try and sift out what we know really works and what we don't. And that was written in 2018, so it's only 3 years old. And so there is goodwill, I guess, on the part of academics to try and pull all this stuff together. And I think all the stuff that CIPD doing is fantastic around doing evidence reviews. So if you don't feel confident going to a client and talking about, say, resilience, for instance, and the client is like, well, or you diagnose the issue of lack of employee resilience, for example, then you can go away and read this rapid evidence review and very quickly get up to speed on what the research is telling us about resilience. And you've got well-being, whether financial incentives work, stuff around motivation, organizational commitment, well-being, and financial well-being as well. And even I've got a quote here from BCG, who put ground change programs in evidence is now BCG's first step in leaders can use evidence-based approaches to turn transformations from reactive necessity into a competitive opportunity. And I like that, actually. I like the idea that if an organization is willing to experiment with the evidence and see what works, that gives you enormous strategic advantage over other organizations who are just plucking interventions out of the sky, implementing them and not really knowing whether they work or not. So I think if you can embed this process, that itself is a process of change. So yeah, just to finish up then, I think there's all that we're going in the right direction, I think, and that synthesis of bringing all those models together, what the CIP are doing, consultants seem to be moving in the right direction. I think there's some things that maybe we need to still improve on, and this was written in 2001 by Pettigrew and Woodman, who are just sort of saying, well, what do we need to get better at in change management for it to become more robust, or organisational change for it to become a more robust practice? And they're saying, you know, we really need to understand context, and we really need to understand the science of complexity, because organisations are complex systems, which is why I've started writing about complexity. When we go into organisations, we need to understand the history of the organisation and what's happening, and as I mentioned at the beginning, what lens we're using to interpret that history as well, because that's so important. What people's prior experiences are heavily biased how they're going to accept change going forward. And then we've got, you know, more confidence in causal claims. So how do we link this change to this performance? How can I be more confident? Because at the end of the day, as a practitioner, that's what I'm selling. I'm selling to my client, if you do this, it's more likely to work than something else. And I know it's different. I know it's difficult. You know, you've got to separate out all the other effects that are going on in organisations. But that's kind of the end point, and that's what we should be aiming for. And it's not, we're not trying to get to a point of truth. We're just trying to get to being more confident in our claims. That's all. And yeah, there's the pacing as well. I think there's sort of a lack of research, a lack of understanding about when do we move fast, when do we slow things down in change, when do we know organisations are ready. The readiness literature is quite confused and disparate, I think. And lastly, something that I'm quite passionate about is how we get scholars and practitioners working together. You know, I think scholars can really help us design experiments within, and CIPD have done this. They've worked with universities working in the civil service, for example, and designed quite robust studies to see whether interventions are working or not. And I think they can really help us and get stuff published that's actually real life, real interventions in an organisation. I think all that sort of information is really helpful to us in our practice as well. So I think we need to get better at that. And to be honest with you, I think academics are really up for this, because academics are always looking for organisations that they can go into and fiddle and play with if the organisation will let them. So yeah, so that's it from me. Thank you so much for all the comments. And I don't know whether